Something else that I think is particularly notable that's happened in the last couple of months is really the launch of a potentially exciting new era of US-China cooperation on energy and climate change issues. Secretary Clinton was in China in February, and energy and climate change was at the top of her agenda. And this is really one of the first times we've seen climate and energy at the top of the US-China bilateral agenda. There certainly are many areas where the US and China could have a shared interest in scaling up their activities for cooperation, and I think coal is one of the key ones for the reasons that I mentioned previously, as well as expanded cooperation in energy efficiency and renewable energy. Up until now, of course, in the international negotiations, lack of action by the United States has really been the easiest excuse for inaction by China. There's really been no reason for China to get out in front of the United States on climate change as a developing country. But I think it'll be interesting to see how this dynamic changes if the United States if it does come forward with mandatory climate regulation there. And then the question will, at that point, become how do we engage China in the climate negotiations? And I think it's important to consider both what's politically feasible within China, but also what is technically feasible. And this gets back to my point earlier about the ability to measure and quantify and verify emissions there. In terms of the outlook for Copenhagen, I think I would say that the US is unlikely to be ready to commit to a quantifiable target in December of 2009. I say unlikely, I don't think it's impossible, but I think many would agree with me on this point. And this really has to do with the timing of moving of legislation through Congress, which I mentioned, and I'll talk more about in a moment. The problem with US not potentially being ready to sign on to an exact target this early is that developing countries may also not be prepared to enter into binding commitments before the United States assumes a binding international target. And this, of course, runs the risk of delaying the whole process. So what can we expect? Well, I think a really positive sign is that we do see a very clear indication of where US target ranges might lie. We've had President Obama put forward proposals to reduce US emissions by about 16 to 17% from current levels, or about 15% from 2005 levels by 2020, and 80% by 2050. The 2020 targets equate roughly to stabilization at 1990 levels by 2020. The problem, of course, we have is that there's a huge gap right now between the level of ambition between the US targets that are being proposed and the EU, the targets that the European Union has put forward. And I think this is going to need to be worked out. The Waxman-Markey targets, by the way, are a bit more aggressive, potentially more like 7% below 1990 levels by 2020. So again, this would essentially be our Kyoto target a bit late. A key issue in the US, of course, is this issue of timing of Congress. It is possible, but unlikely, I think, that legislation will be passed this year. Things are moving very quickly on the House side. The Senate is really waiting to see what happens in the House. And in past years, really, most of the action has been in the Senate, so there's a pretty good idea of what some draft legislation might look like there. And I think another point is that even if we don't have an entire US mandatory cap-and-trade program package passed by December, it's very likely we would have other pieces of legislation that could feed into an international agreement. And there are key elements, perhaps, of an international agreement on adaptation, on technology and finance for clean technologies that could potentially be put forth by the administration in a much shorter time frame. So I think that's important to consider. Turning back to China and what might be feasible there, of course, depending on what happens in the United States, I think in terms of ideas to look at for what you might expect from China in terms of commitments, targets that change based on their economic situation. So an example of this would be intensity-based targets, targets indexed to their economic growth. Also being discussed are targets that would cover only a portion of their economy, for example, a sectoral target perhaps linked to some sort of crediting program, perhaps a scaled-up version of the clean development mechanism, or a commitment that would be policy-based, so looking at some of the domestic policies that China is already doing at home and perhaps committing to those in an international agreement. Renewable energy targets, for example, it could be fuel economy standards or energy intensity goals. Another thing that's being discussed that directly affects China, of course, is the reform of the Clean Development Mechanism. There's a discussion of moving from project-based crediting to more programmatic, broader crediting, perhaps crediting policy commitments or sector-wide actions. And the real idea here is that although the CDM in some ways has been successful, one of the ways in which it's been criticized is that the scale of reductions that it's achieving in developing countries is just not sufficient to get us where we need to be in terms of the science. So to end with a bit of a summary of where I see the outlook for Copenhagen today, I think we can aim to achieve an intermediary agreement that would outline the key elements of a post-2012 framework. And an example of what you might see in this intermediary framework would be a definition that you would have binding economy-wide targets for developed countries. You might have a certain type of commitment defined for certain major emerging economies. You might see clear support mechanisms on technology, finance, and adaptation in developing countries fleshed out. But of course, an intermediate agreement is going to be most credible if there's something real behind it, if it's not too vague. And ideally, you would have, if not specific targets, target ranges, for example, for the developed countries. But this difference I mentioned earlier about the gap between the current EU and US ambition levels in their targets is somewhat challenging here. And I think all of this really does hinge in some ways on how far the US Congress gets between now and December. I've heard various scenarios where perhaps you wouldn't need legislation completely codified into law, but you could have different signals sent from Congress if legislation was at a very close stage to being passed. That could be a scenario in which a target could be committed to, but I think more likely you would see key elements of an international agreement put forth ahead of a full cap-and-trade program. For example, I know that appropriations have already been submitted for the Clean Technology Fund, which was proposed last year, as well as on avoided deforestation in developing countries and on funding for adaptation. So I will wrap there, and if there's time for questions, I'll take them. Otherwise, happy to take them offline. Thank you.